The regent, Louise of Savoy, tried desperately to hold on to the reins of power, while also desperately trying to secure her son's release. It was an almost impossible task. In Spain, the French king fell seriously ill. He had migraines, fevers, and intense pains throughout his body. At the end of the summer, after 6 months behind bars, he was thought to be close to death. His mother and sister were deeply concerned, but as regent, Louise of Savoy couldn't leave the kingdom, so she turned to Margaret for help.
My child, only you can save your brother. Bring us back our king. Yes, Mother.
Charles V gave Margaret of Valois special dispensation to enter Spain. She hurried to her brother's sickbed. Francis seemed to be at death's door. He'd lost a lot of weight and was tormented by fever. He was so sick he was unable to eat or drink. His sister nursed her brother day and night. Margaret was a devout Catholic. She prayed desperately for her brother and held Mass in his cell.
The body of Christ.
As day broke, the king opened his eyes.
Francis, open your mouth to receive communion.
Sister. The fever seemed to have mysteriously stopped. Across Europe, the King of France's recovery was seen as a miracle.
Thank you, sister.
Be brave.
After suffering for 24 days, he was almost back to full health. Margaret could now fulfill the other part of her mission. On October 3rd, 1525, she arrived in Toledo to negotiate with Charles V. But the emperor went back on his promise to meet her. This was a huge insult to the sister of the French king. After having waited several hours, Charles V's ministers finally agreed to see her. Margaret was young, intelligent, and very persuasive. She soon became popular in the Spanish court. Charles V finally granted her an audience.
Your king is stubborn, madam. He gets what he deserves.
Margaret refused to be intimidated. She offered Charles the Duchy of Burgundy, along with a substantial ransom to secure her brother's freedom.
Listen to me. Either King Francis accepts the terms of the treaty, or he spends the rest of his life in prison.
Margaret had failed, but she refused to let her brother rot in prison. If the Emperor wouldn't set Francis free, she would. Every night, at the same time, a servant brought the French king firewood. Margaret noticed that the man came and went without attracting the guards' attention. This gave her an idea. She asked him to swap clothes with the king. It was a very risky strategy. If she were caught, Margaret would be thrown in prison. But she would risk everything to free her brother. Her plan was simple. Francis would slip out of his cell disguised as the valet.
What do you think?
I think it'll be perfect.
Not forgetting to darken his skin with soot.
Guards! 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 Guard! He's escaping!
Their plan had been rumbled.
Oh! Hey! Hey! Hey!
But Charles V didn't imprison Margaret. He allowed her to return home to her mother in France. Louise of Savoy was now so concerned for her son's life and the future of the kingdom that she wrote to Francois, begging him to agree to the emperor's demands. On January 14, 1526, with a very heavy heart, Francis signed the Treaty of Madrid. He renounced any claims to Artois and Flanders. He surrendered Burgundy and abandoned any aspirations to the Duchy of Milan. To make him honor the terms of the treaty, Charles forced Francois to hand over his two sons as hostages, the 8-year-old Dauphin Francis and his 6-year-old brother Henri. No sooner had Francis returned to France than he raised an army against the emperor. Charles's response to this treachery was to strip the French princes of all comforts. They were imprisoned in a dark, damp room with no furniture other than 2 stools and straw mattresses. The boys were abandoned and had no one to talk to. As the days turned to months, and months to years, the youngest son, Henri, forgot how to speak his native tongue. Louise of Savoy was devastated when she was told of the terrible conditions her grandsons were being held. She tried desperately to secure their freedom, but all diplomacy failed. There was only one option: take them by force. In May 1526, King Francis formed the Holy League of Cognac. It was an anti-Spanish alliance which brought together France, England, the papacy, and the cities of Milan, Florence, and Venice. Their common enemy, the overambitious Charles V. The emperor was furious at his enemy's alliance. On May 6, 1527, he sent 12,000 men to attack the city of Rome. Pope Clement was forced to flee the Vatican. 1 month later, he was caught. In exchange for his life, he gave Charles 400,000 ducats and the city of Rome. The defeat led to the dissolution of the Holy League of Cognac, and an isolated Francis lost battle after battle. After more than a year of fighting, Francis was ready to sue for peace. He refused to stoop so low as to negotiate himself. His mother led the negotiations, with Charles V's aunt, Margaret of Austria. In August 1529, the treaty known as the Ladies' Peace was signed at Cambrai. As with the Madrid Treaty 3 years earlier, France pledged to renounce any claims to Artois and Flanders, give up Burgundy, and the town of Tournai in the north of the kingdom, and give up any rights to Italy. In any case, the last of the Sforzas had been restored in Milan with the obligation of returning the duchy to Spain on his death. France had lost Italy, and to make matters worse, the heir to the throne and his brother were still held hostage in Spain. In exchange for their freedom, Charles V demanded a ransom of 2 million gold crowns, but France's treasury was almost empty.
What are we going to do? Lord, this is a difficult decision.
Let me think. We don't have much choice. We must pay the Emperor to ensure the freedom of the Dauphin and his brother.
Lord, your mistake at Pavia cost us dearly.
Raising the funds for the huge ransom was all but impossible. But Louise was determined to free her grandsons. She turned to the citizens of France for help. She imposed a special tax on the population for 1 year. Eventually, there was enough money to free the young princes. Francis was now 13, Henri was 11. On July 6th, after 5 long years,
Ah, my sons!
Francis's sons were returned to him.
I missed you both. Look at me. Haven't you grown? And you, what a fine young man you are!
In return, as imposed by the Treaty of Cambrai, Francis married the emperor's daughter, Eleanor of Habsburg. Francis and Charles V were now brothers-in-law. But Francis still harbored ambitions to overthrow the emperor. So, despite the treachery of the past, he once again approached Henry VIII, King of England. 12 years after the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Henry VIII and Francis met between French-held Boulogne and English held Calais. The French king proudly introduced his children to his English ally.
What fine sons. Congratulations.
Henry was also keen to introduce the French king to someone dear to him, his beautiful mistress, Anne Boleyn. She was in fact the real reason for Henry's visit.
She has stolen my heart. My beloved Anne.
Anne Boleyn was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. She had been educated in the French courts and had completely bewitched Henry. Henry wanted Francis to persuade the Pope to allow him to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so he could wed Anne. But to gain Francis's support, Anne had to win the approval of the whole French royal family. Not just the king, but his sister and his new wife, Eleanor of Habsburg. But Francis refused to allow them to meet a woman considered by many to be a whore.
Don't touch me!
When Anne got wind of this, she felt deeply offended. For 6 days, Henry and Francis ate, drank, and were entertained. During the final banquet, Anne, her face hidden behind a mask, danced for the two sovereigns. It was her last chance to charm Francis. Her gamble paid off. The French king thanked her publicly, signaling his approval.
Do you, Lady Anne Boleyn, take this man to be your lawful wife?
2 weeks later,
I do.
Henry and Anne are believed to have married in secret.
Do you, Henry VIII, take this lady to be your lawfully wedded wife?
I do.
The hasty ceremony is believed to have been rushed forward to cover up the fact that Henry's mistress was already pregnant. After 3 years of peace in Europe, Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, died without having sired a male heir. In accordance with the terms of the Cambria Ladies' Treaty, Charles V could now add the Duchy of Milan to his empire. But the King of France had not given up on Italy. In February 1536, Francis I sent an army to invade Savoy so that he could trade it for the Duchy of Milan. But Charles V had sent troops to attack Provence. As war started to rage again, tragedy struck at the heart of the Kingdom of France. On August 10, 1536, Francis the Dauphin died suddenly at the age of 18. Immediately, rumors began to spread that he'd been poisoned or that he had died of tuberculosis, a consequence of his incarceration in Spain. In mourning and at war, Francis's kingdom, just like Charles V's empire, had to face up to a lack of money. Conflicts would have to stop. In 1538, the king and the emperor decided to start negotiating once more. After several weeks of haggling in Nice, the two men made their new friendship public at Aigues-Mortes in the south of France. For the first time, both men signed a 10-year truce, during which each would hold on to his territories while pledging not to go to war again. Charles V kept Milan and kept hold of his empire, but officially renounced any claim to the French throne. This was a real triumph for Francis I, who consolidated France's central role in Europe and left an indelible mark on the kingdom. But in 1547, the King of France was riven with sickness. He was 52 and suffering from migraines, gout, and an ailment caused by his serial infidelity, syphilis. Prayers were said for him. Masses were performed by his bedside in the presence of his beloved sister Margaret. From his deathbed, Francis called for his son, and now heir to the throne, Henry.
I've been a great sinner, my son. Passion has led me astray. But if I have done good things, follow that example. Be a man.
In the early hours of March the 31st, 1547, King Francis I breathed his last. His son became King Henry II. Alongside his lifelong enemy, Charles V, Francis I remains one of the most powerful monarchs of the Christian era. From 1540 onwards, the emperor too was beginning to ail. He was terribly afflicted with gout. 4 years later, he handed over the reins of the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Ferdinand. Then in October 1555, he passed sovereignty over the Netherlands to his son, Philip of Spain. Charles V's abdication shocked all of Europe. From his Spanish retreat, he relied on his brother and his son to carry on his work. But the Habsburg dynasty was to be divided forever. He died on September 21st, 1558, at the age of 58, 11 years after Francis I.